You are tuned to Anubhav 2.0 podcast from senior citizens, catalyzed and supported by the Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment, Government of India, through National Institutes for Social Defense and Media for Community Foundation. The project is conceived and designed by Dr. R. Sridhar and supported by Ashish Tiwari, Pooja Murada, Sai Sudha, and Kaushalya.
கூடுங்கள் கேளுங்கள் நண்பர்களே, இளமையில் நாம் செய்ய நினைத்ததை முதுமையில் செய்ய இயலுமே என்று வாருங்கள் வாருங்கள் நண்பர்களே, கூடுங்கள் கேளுங்கள் நண்பர்களே. கோவை வானில் ஒன்றாய் கூடி சிந்திப்போம், கேட்போம், மகிழ்வோம், சிந்திப்போம், கேட்போம், மகிழ்வோம்.
Nice conversation with Mr. G.N. Rajagopal, who is also celebrating his 94th birthday. Happy birthday, sir. We seek your blessings. And Mrs. Bala Saraswati Sriram, and she is our new entrant in the Kovai Chinmayam. And Mrs. Lekha Nair, who is also a resident of Kovai Chinmayam and the mother of a very beautiful girl, Radhika. And Miss Bhuvana Iyer is the daughter of Mr. Rajagopal, and she is only, her age I will not say because she is quite young. And of course, we have Mrs. Sandhya Narendranath, who is also in her 70s. And we have a very young man, Naveen Yamuna, from the UK, whose mother also stays in Kovai Chinmayam retirement community. Now the subject that we are thinking of discussing today is on a very interesting subject which is quite popular and very affects all of us, is the generation gap. So let us find out from you, what is this generation gap all about? Because I never heard this in my younger days, but of late I started hearing it more and more, not only from my daughters but from my granddaughters. So sir, since you are the youngest man in this gathering, Mr. Rajagopal, please tell me, sir, what to you is generation gap?
Okay, sir. I never knew that there is a word called generation gap, because I grew up in a family where we were 10 members living in one house, and common opinions never differed. Thereby, no counter arguments from any side. That's all. No
And if you had differing views, how was that resolved?
Generally, it doesn't happen. If at all, we adjust together, and there's nothing like particular generation gap. You should hear the elders, not like that. If the advisors or whatever comments they say, it should we all agree together. No counter argument.
So in your generation, there was more of agreement. That's what you are saying. More of consensus.
Yeah.
And now let us ask young Naveen, what do you understand by generation gap at your young age of 24?
I understand generation gap to be trends in the way that one generation think versus trends in the way another generation speaks or thinks. For example, my parents' generation, the way they grew up in India, the time they grew up, I think they were very focused on getting corporate jobs and having really good careers. And because they're able to have such good careers, their children, so my generation, had the luxury or privilege perhaps to grow up abroad, perhaps to not necessarily feel the need to study a STEM subject, perhaps study humanities or the arts. So I think that kind of thinking perhaps, or that kind of life circumstance results in different ways of thinking, different priorities, what you value perhaps, what you're allowed to value, this kind of thing.
Do you feel there is a generation gap between your mom and you?
Definitely so.
How?
It may just be a difference between me and her. It may not be, who knows whether it's necessarily a generational gap. But I would say that she is more, her values lie more with doing good hard work, working hard, like achieving results. I think me, I'm a bit more, just
Relaxed.
a bit more relaxed perhaps. I would say that there's less of a generation gap between me and my mother than my mother and her mother, who also lives here. It seems to me that there's a larger generational gap, more changed in India between my grandmother's generation and my mother's generation than between my mother's generation and my generation.
Thank you.
That's a very interesting point you brought to the table. Thank you.
Mrs. Sriram, you have lived your life perhaps in the US, when you have come to India. Do you think that this generation gap really exists here, or it differs from what you felt in the US?
I have not felt this gap either here or there. I grew up in a multi-generational family, just like Mr. Rajagopalan did. We were 12, 14 members with both sides of the grandparents living with us. And we never felt that there was any significant difference in the way we think and the way they think. Maybe at that time it was a top-down model. We always adhered to what the elders taught us and showed us. Now that I'm in the US, I've been there for the last, I would say, at least 35, 40 years. And currently I live in a multi-generational family setup across different cultural boundaries as well. And we all seem to get along very well. Yes, we have differences, but that's not because of the generation per se. I think it's the way one thinks, as he put it. You know, my daughter does not accept the term generation gap at all. She said, no, Mom, it's not a generation gap. It's the way like you think and the way I think. My grandkids, they said, no, Grandma, you think just like us. We think like you. We love your thought process. So I think it's, again, this terminology, generation gap, is just a buzzword that has swept the world. And we're getting back to this multi-generational lifestyle like I'm experiencing here in CovaiCare. I get along equally well with Mr. Rajagopalan as I do with our Maina, our new Mona Lisa and dining hall, and our young adults who live here. I get along very well with them as well. So if there was a generational gap, I would have felt it.
So according to you, it is all in the mind.
It is all in the mind.
And nothing to do with age.
It has nothing to do with age.
Okay. Now we'll ask Ms. Bona here, who is daughter of Mr. Rajagopal. And since you are living with your parents in this retirement community, how do you experience this generation gap? Or you also feel there is no gap in your house as far as generation is concerned and outside your house?
Thank you, Kanal sir, for giving me this opportunity. Basically, I agree with Naveen and Mrs. Balasaraswati because I think when there are two people, there are two opinions. It doesn't matter which generation they come from. So I didn't feel the generation gap as my father put it. We also lived in a joint family where my father's brother, my grandparents, we all lived together. As a child, I've grown up like that. So I didn't see that it is a gap. I only feel that they come from a different schooling and we all come from a different schooling. So that doesn't make any gap. It's the person and the individual preferences that makes the difference. So that's my humble opinion, sir.
Thank you. And Mrs. Lekha Nair, you come from Kerala, basically. And we have perhaps the oldest population in the country in Kerala. And you also must have grown up in Kerala or outside Kerala. And you are mother of a daughter. And you tell me, is there any generation gap that you see between yourself and your daughter or your mother or your grandmother?
Just to clarify, I did not live in Kerala.
Okay.
I was brought up in Bangalore and lived all over India for the rest of my life. As far as generation gap is concerned, I found that our populations, especially people from Kerala, when they shifted outside, they brought with them that way of thinking, that way of culture. And my parents were the first generation to move out from their home home state. And when they moved to another state, I think there were lots of anxieties that they felt about how their children were going to grow up in a different culture. And we lived in the Bangalore of the 60s, which was highly westernized, with the Anglo-Indian community all around us. And we almost kind of lived a very different life than what our parents lived. And at that age, I think at teenage, there was a generation gap, or I don't know what kind of gap it was, but it was a gap, because there was so much of angst. My father insisted that I come home by 5:30, whereas my friends would all be out, and we were not allowed to go out dating or dancing or go out to parties with boyfriends. If if a boy called me up on the phone, there would be mayhem. It would be crazy, and then it would be curfew, grounded for the next 10 days. And then everything was quizzed, like, who are you talking to? Are you going to a friend's house where does she have a brother? So that sort of thing happened. So I think I went through all that till about 2023, when I realized that it's just the anxiety that's talking and not any other thing. So that gap was there. And now, as my children grew up, I found a lot of times I'm saying things that my parents said to me. I'm saying that to my kids, and I hold myself back and say, hey, that's not me talking, that's my mom. But one thing I also found was that with my grandmother, there was no gap at all. In fact, when my son wanted to grow his hair long and pierce his ears, my grandmother said, yeah, of course, because my father did that too. He had a kudumi and he had earrings. So that's fine, you can do that. So I'm thinking the gap is something which arises out of anxiety for the next generation. Are they going to be okay? Or are they going to make the same mistakes that we did? That's my take on the gap.
One thing is, I also have 2 daughters and 2 granddaughters. But there's one thing which I get to hear from my children and my grandchildren is, you don't know Appa or you don't know Nana. Basically, they are trying to tell me that I don't know what they know, and perhaps they are trying to tell me that you are a bit of an outdated guy, and we will tell you. So, what do I take this as? It's a love between the grandfather and the grandchildren, or it is to be accepted that they are different to what my generation was. Sir.
Not much to say about this, because in every house this dialogue is there. Father, you don't know.
You get to hear from your wife also.
So they used to say, Father, you don't know the present world. We belong to the new world, you belong to the old world, you belong to the old school and all. But somehow I am not funny. Somehow we advise the children. We also come from a good school and all the things. We also know what is what. Please hear us. This is the way we interact with them.
So I want to ask you, Mrs. Sandhya, that Sir was talking about advice. The word advice to our children or the current generation, is it taken correctly or it is taken as imposing ourselves on them?
Sir, actually my mother-in-law, one incident I am just telling you, which I had undergone many times. Her nature was so good that if we do any mistakes, she will not say, don't do that. She won't say that. She used to tell, I think Sandhya, this is very nice, but if you do instead of this, if you do the other way, it will be nice, why don't you try that? You can look into it. Then what used to happen, I used to think, yeah, I can do like that, no, that's correct. But she never says, don't do it. Even to her own son, my husband, once what happened, sir, example I'm telling you. He wanted to buy some Chirag Din shirts, It was very costly that time, 450. Now it is 450 is nothing. But that time, in 73, 74, it was costly.
So I also felt it is costly. Why we should buy? You should buy. My mother-in-law also felt, but she told in a nice way, See, why you want to buy Naren like that? Then he said, no ma, I don't know why I liked that shirt. I want to buy it. Then she said, see, you have lot of shirts, no? In that you like that only. Okay, you see if the quality is good and if you feel it is okay, then you buy. Just think. She puts the ball into our court. So we think, if you say don't do it, that will become a offense. Like usually.
Exactly. My granddaughter says
instead
she likes me more than my wife because my wife keeps telling her, don't do it, no. Whereas I don't say anything. So she says, you are the greatest grandfather that I could have ever had. So you're absolutely right.
So my mother-in-law used to tell in that way, correct us in that way. It's not the thing she never used to correct us. For everything she used to correct. But in a nice way, So we used to think, that if I do that, it's good. I'll do that way. Like that. That's a good way actually. In one way, don't do that. Don't do this means that will, I think, I don't know how it.
Let's ask young Naveen, do you like to be advised or you don't like to be advised but only informed?
How would you define being informed? What do you mean by being informed?
Just tell you, not advise you. Like there are two ways of saying it.
Sure.
So I'm advising you that don't do this, don't do that.
Yeah.
I mean, this is what I think that your future should be. So
Yeah.
this is kind of an advice. Being informed means that there is an opportunity for you there in that particular field.
Sure.
You would like to look at it. Like the way Mr. Sandhya was saying as to how positively it was saying.
I don't mind getting advice, but sometimes if I've heard the advice before, or there are certain situations I can't really think of them right now, where if I've heard the advice before, or if I know, if someone gives me advice, for example, if my father gives me advice, or my mother gives me advice, and I'll listen to it, but I'll think to myself, I view this in a completely different way. So I'll let them speak, but I won't necessarily, I know that I would approach that same situation in a different way. So I'm happy to receive advice, but I may not always agree with their way of looking at things, perhaps.
Thank you. I want to ask you, Bona, that I personally feel that I may be wrong. You correct me. Today you are taking care of your parents who are, they're slightly old, much older than you. Do you advise them or they advise you?
That's a very tricky question. And my father is sitting right here, but anyway, I'll try.
No, we'll ask him after that. What?
Actually, a bit of both because, he is the one who taught me how to walk from the beginning when I was born. So there is a bit of advice on both sides, and his advice is because of his experience. He's got, but for my advice, I won't call it an advice. I only ask him as a request because I see that if he does certain things, it's going to affect his health. So only the underlying concern, I tell him, to do certain things in a certain way.
So her advice is concern for you.
Yeah.
And your advice is for her to improve. Am I right, sir?
Right.
Now you tell me, do you like her concern towards you and telling you, Appa, don't do this, don't do that, be careful, walk correctly?
She is concerned more. So some of her what are I definitely hear the health point of view. But other things I have my own opinion.
So ultimately you do what you want to do.
Not like that.
Huh.
It's something like exchange of ideas.
That was a good one.
Yes, ma'am. You tell me. At your young age, do you take advice or you give advice?
I think it's more a dialogue anymore. If you give advice, it has to be justified. I think it's the more of the their worldview versus mine. They are growing up in a totally different age versus when I grew up. So if I try to say something or share something with them, if I'm able to justify the reasoning, it's very well taken. Likewise, my daughter, just like Mama and Huma, she says things for my own good, out of concern. Not in a dictatorial manner that, Mom, you got to do this. No. She'll justify why she's saying what she's saying. So then it becomes more of a two-way dialogue versus a top-down model. It all boils down to her worldview versus mine, my experiences versus hers. They're totally different, right? We have different friends, they have different friends. And like she said, when she was growing up and the parents, she grew up in quite an orthodox environment, like all of us did. Again, I don't think it was generational again. It was more cultural, the way we were brought up. The cultural differences also creep into the picture.
Okay.
Because my family, we are an international family. My son-in-law is from Slovakia, as I shared with you. The way they were raised was meat and potatoes. But they adapted. Once he decided to get married to my daughter, he flipped over. He said, this is going to be a vegetarian home. So again, I did not impose it on him. Neither did my daughter.
He's a very sensible man.
He's a sensible man. And he loves the vegetarianism. He said, this is the most healthy diet, Mom, that you have introduced to us. Likewise, his parents also, they were all raised in Slovakia back during the German genocide, and they've seen all of that.
Okay, Mrs. Lekha Nair, I want to ask you, do you advise your husband or does he ever advise you?
I think one thing I learned is never give advice till it's asked for.
To anybody?
To anybody.
Except the husband?
No, the husband, in fact, the moment he sees that look on my face that I'm going to say something, he'll say, I know what you're going to say, don't tell me that. So then we are done with that. And I think as we grow older as a couple, what happens is it's not one person advising the other. It's just like, we point out the stop signs and the go signs and say, hey, look, I think this is not okay and that's not okay. And sometimes it's taken, sometimes it's not. But I think there is always a room for, conversation, whether something should be done or something should not be done. One thing I've learned is decisions which are taken in collaboration in the family always work best. Because when I was growing up, there was no question of democracy in the family. There was dad at the top and the rest of us were kind of, So then I learned that doesn't work because there's so much of angst left in you, when decisions are taken of which you are not a part of. And those things come out in some other way. So I learned that when I had my kids, I need to make them part of all decisions that we made. But the funny thing is, my son turned out to be very conservative, very orthodox. He didn't want things that I wanted at his age. So that made me relook again at that generation gap. Because I found that he was more like my parental generation, and my daughter says things like, Mom, don't laugh too loud. So yeah, they're all very kind of, prim and proper. And so I'm the odd one out, and it looks like the generations have reversed, in fact, Like I was telling you earlier, sir, my husband and I, we are both non-believers, atheists. But my son is like a very religious person. He wants all the pujas and things done. And my parents were like that. So again, we are kind of, out of that generation. So I think there is always a disconnect somewhere between the generations. I'm not sure what a generation is today. It's no longer the 25 years that we thought of. I think it's shrinking now. The gap is shrinking much more. It's something like 10,
the Gen Zs have come,
yes,
right?
10, 12 years. So every 10 or 12 years, we're finding a huge shift in the way people think, behave, opinions, and the technology.
See, I want to ask you, right from my young Naveen, there's always a time when we grew up with our parents, they drew a line, and if you crossed it, they pushed you back. At least that's what happened during my childhood.
Yeah.
I'm sure the same thing must have happened during Sir and Mrs. Sandhya. Today, is it correct to say that that line gets shifted and not towards the parents but away from them? That is the line that I drew with my wife is we are forced to draw it towards our children and increase it, the distance between us. So is it a fact because of the generations becoming smaller and smaller than it was during the sir's time or the day when we were all brought up? Or do you think that we or the current generation does not know how to bring up children, or we brought up our children better? Naveen.
Just to be clear, so when you say the line is drawn closer towards the children, do you mean that the children can misbehave more before the parents?
The parents accept the misbehavior.
So that does seem to be the case. It seems to be the case that in the past, parenting was more strict, more disciplinarian. I don't think that's necessarily a good thing or a bad thing. And it's not necessarily going to always continue in this direction. It may be that my generation, or perhaps the generation after me when we parent, might decide to be more disciplinarian than what we've experienced. Things perhaps go in cycles, or I don't know. As to why that's the case, I'm not sure. I don't think it's necessarily because of the generations becoming smaller. I would say that technology makes things a lot harder for parents these days. I grew up, when I was growing up, I mean, social media was just about starting to be a thing in my later teens. So I think for parents now, their children at a very young age have the internet all around them. It's a lot harder to moderate that if all of their friends are also on social media. And so I think as technology changes, perhaps parenting becomes more difficult. So it's hard to say, to be honest. And maybe it's difficult for me to say because I'm not yet a parent. Yeah.
Thank you. So I want to ask you one thing, that in your life, you felt always that you are the head of the family and everybody had to listen to you, except of course your wife, to whom you listened. But your children, you had a feeling that they have to listen to whatever I say, and I don't have to listen to them. But as you have aged, it has become the reverse has become true. Is it correct for me to assume that you are also accepting today what your daughter is telling you, and you are not telling your daughter anything?
But the head of the family law is, I am not for it. I am not for it. So myself, me and my wife, we gave them very good, education. We brought them in our more traditional way. And we taught them how to respect elders, how to give respect to the other people and all. So that way we are happy. And in that things we never interfere in their own matters. That way smoothness. It's always followed smooth. There's nothing of you have to listen to me and I won't hear you. I will go in my own way. It doesn't happen. Such thing never happened in my life. So whatever I say, it's okay. Mostly, I will say what they can only.
Okay. So you are being very diplomat about the whole thing.
Very diplomatic.
You say only what they want to hear and obey. Sir, my father was not like you. I can tell you one thing. He had a very fine man. He taught me so many things. Whatever I am today in my life, I owe it to him. But he was very clear that there is a line that you cross it, you'll push me. If I continue to cross it, he used to take out his belt and hit me.
Oh.
Yes.
Maybe you were a badmash kid.
Even now.
Yes. Exactly.
At 75. But one day I asked him, he said, you tried so many things with me. I'm the eldest in my family. I said, my brothers and all, you didn't even touch them and you didn't even, shout at them and you didn't do anything. I said, why? Why this disparity? His answer was very simple. We tried with you because you are the first child. We failed. Therefore, why try with your brothers and sisters? So, do you think that the first child is the one who gets to
Always.
always?
Yes.
And the youngest one normally gets away with everything.
They are pampered.
Yes, I'm the second child, so I know I had it easy.
I'm the middle child, so I got both sides.
I'm the eldest and I got the brunt of everything. And my parents said, no, that's because we were new. We didn't know what else to do.
So thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This has been a very interesting conversation on generations and generational gap and no gap. But I personally feel that all of us have got life's experiences, and that perhaps makes the generation gap grow smaller. And as we grow older, perhaps we are also learned a lot, and therefore we are also changing the way that we behave to the current generation. So I think that is the outcome, and that is what I'm seeing when I talk to my grandchildren, and when I talk to my own age group people, and somebody who is much elder to me. I'm very hesitant to get into a very serious argument with them. That is just out of what I was taught when I was young. So thank you very much for this time that you spent with us. And once this podcast is broadcast, I'll send you the link. And I really enjoyed it. I hope you enjoyed this small conversation.
We should do this more often, Colonel.
Thank you and stay tuned.